It all happened in less than 3 seconds, but it was enough to make the entire room freeze. A high society party in the Hamptons had been drifting along peacefully under the soft evening light, which glinted off wine glasses, expensive dresses, and people who were always trying to appear perfect. Then a waitress walked by, accidentally brushing against the train of a white silk dress. It was just a tiny, almost insignificant touch, but the reaction that followed was anything but. A slap rang out, so sharp that every conversation stopped at once. Vanessa Cole stood there, poised and cold, her hand still hovering in the air, as if the act she'd just committed required no explanation. The waitress took a small step back, one hand gently touching her cheek, but she didn't cry, didn't apologize, and she didn't bow her head. She just looked straight at Vanessa. Her gaze wasn't one of fear nor of weakness. It was unsettlingly calm. Then she spoke, her voice very soft. "You should remember there are some things you can't buy." Vanessa just gave a faint smile, as if she'd just heard something meaningless, then turned away to resume her flawless performance for the crowd. No one in the room realized that everything had just changed, because right outside the gates, 3 black cars had pulled up, their engines just cut, and the silver logos on their sides reflected the evening light, signaling that nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Before the 3 black cars stopped outside the gates, before anyone in the room knew who the woman in the waitress uniform really was, the party in the Hamptons had been prepared like a perfect stage, where every glass had to catch the light at the right angle, every bouquet had to be set at the right height, and every smile had to appear at the right moment. The Cole family mansion was near the coast, stark white and sprawling, with perfectly manicured hedges and a driveway so long that by the time guests stepped out of their cars, they felt they were entering a world where money wasn't just for living, but for proving something to society. Margaret Cole understood that perfectly. She wasn't born into New York's old money elite, but she'd spent nearly her entire life learning how to enter it. She learned how to choose wine, how to invite the right people, how to talk about art as if she'd grown up in Manhattan's galleries, and how to smile just enough to seem friendly, but never cheap. For Margaret, being rich was never enough. She wanted recognition. She wanted the Cole name to be mentioned at private dinners on the Upper East Side, at fundraisers attended by families who had held their wealth for generations, in rooms where a single handshake could unlock more power than a signed contract. And Vanessa Cole was her most perfect project. Vanessa was raised to know how to walk into a room and make heads turn. She knew which shade of lipstick softened her face in candlelight, when to place a hand on a man's arm to create a sense of intimacy, how to lower her voice when speaking of kindness, and how to cast her eyes down just so when she wanted someone to believe she was humble. In front of a crowd, Vanessa was like a woman created for the society pages, beautiful, composed, elegant, and seemingly always thoughtful at the right time. She could ask a server how they were in a sweet voice when guests were nearby. She could speak about charities with a soft look in her eyes. She could make someone she'd just met feel she was both wealthy and kind. But in hallways where there were no cameras, her voice was different. Not too loud, not too coarse, just a little colder, just enough for the listener to understand their place. And that was exactly what Eleanor Whitmore wanted to see for herself. The Whitmore family was the kind of family that didn't need to say they had power. Their name was on university buildings, on museum boards, and on family investment funds that had existed since Eleanor's great-grandfather's time. They didn't need big parties to prove they were rich. They certainly didn't need to flaunt the things that others were trying to buy to imitate them. On the Usset side, people spoke of Eleanor with a particular caution, not because she was loud, but because she was so calm. She was the kind of woman who could walk into a boardroom without raising her voice or interrupting anyone, and within 10 minutes, everyone would instinctively adjust their posture. Daniel Whitmore, her only son, was different. He was 29, courteous, generous, and had a heart that was easily softened by beautiful things. Daniel grew up with everything, but Eleanor always tried to teach him that wealth is only what is passed down, while character is something each person must build for themselves. He listened, he understood, but he understood it with the mind of someone who had never truly been deceived by appearances. When Vanessa entered his life, Daniel believed he had met a rare kind of woman. She wasn't like the others who only cared about the Whitmore name, or so he thought. She remembered the small stories he told, the kind of coffee he liked, the name of the old family dog at their former home in Connecticut. She knew how to make him feel heard, and for a man accustomed to being seen as an heir rather than a person, that feeling could easily become love. Within just a few months, the society columns began to take notice. Photos of Daniel and Vanessa appeared in high life sections. An evening in Manhattan, a fundraising event at the museum, a weekend in the Hamptons. They were called the couple of the summer, a blend of old heritage and new energy, of an established name and a captivating modern beauty. Margaret read every line like a forecast of victory. She began to speak of the future with an air of near certainty. An engagement party in the Hamptons, a wedding in Newport, a shared home redesigned in a more youthful style, a bigger role for Vanessa in the Whitmore family charities, and then, if all went according to plan, the right to enter the rooms she could previously only peer into from the outside. Vanessa understood the game, too. She wasn't in a hurry. She knew that with families like the Whitmores, you don't storm the front gates with obvious ambition. You smile, bow at the right moments, say you don't need much, and then let them hand you the key. Daniel, however, didn't see any of that. Or, perhaps, he saw small signs, but chose to ignore them. Once, at a restaurant in Manhattan, Vanessa had spoken sharply to a waiter because his water glass was placed on his left side. The moment Daniel turned to look, she immediately smiled and said she was just a little stressed. Another time, at a fundraiser, she spoke movingly about educational opportunities for poor children, but later complained that the long speech had made her late for her hair appointment. Daniel heard these things, but he convinced himself that everyone has their tired moments. Eleanor did not. She had lived long enough to know that a person's true character isn't revealed in beautiful speeches. It's revealed in how they talk to people who can't help them get ahead. It's revealed when a glass is iced, when a server is a step too slow, when an ordinary person accidentally touches something they consider precious. So when Margaret Cole sent an invitation for Eleanor to come to the Hamptons for an intimate pre-engagement party, Eleanor didn't reply right away. She sat for a long time in her study at her Upper East Side townhouse, looking through the window at the trees lining the street. On her desk was the thick invitation, cream paper, black ink, the script so formal it was almost too perfect. She read Vanessa's name, Margaret's name, Daniel's name, and then set the card down. Eleanor wasn't afraid of losing Daniel. What she feared was him entering a marriage where he was only in love with a performance. And if she arrived as Eleanor Whitmore, everyone would bow. They would smile gently. They would choose every word with care. Vanessa would become the most perfect version of herself. Margaret would turn the mansion into a flawless stage. And Daniel would look at it all and believe his mother had been wrong. So Eleanor chose a different path. That morning, she removed the diamond ring from her finger, stored her pearl earrings in a velvet box, and replaced her cream-colored wool dress with a simple black server's uniform. She tied her hair back neatly, put on a small cap, wore a pair of unremarkable low-heeled shoes, and then walked out of her own house through the back door. It wasn't to humble herself. It was to see others clearly, when they thought they no longer had to hide. At the Cole mansion, everything on the surface was still so beautiful it was almost unreal. White flowers draped the entrance. Waitstaff moved swiftly through the rooms. On long tables were trays of cheese, fruit, wine, and small pastries, all arranged as if a single misplaced detail could ruin the entire family's reputation. Margaret paced between the living room and the backyard, constantly adjusting flowers, straightening chairs, and correcting the way the staff stood. She didn't just want this party to be a gathering. She wanted it to be proof that the Cole family was ready to stand as equals with the Whitmores. Meanwhile, Vanessa stood before a mirror on the second floor, wearing a white silk dress custom-made by a rising young designer in New York. The dress was just fitted enough, just elegant enough, and just subtle enough to make people think she hadn't tried too hard, even though every detail had been calculated. She studied her reflection, trying out a softer smile, then a warmer gaze. Today, she didn't just need Daniel to love her. She needed the whole world to believe she was worthy of him. And down below, in a server's uniform no one would notice, Eleanor Whitmore entered that house like an invisible woman. She heard the curt orders. She saw a young staff member get scolded for misplacing a tray of glasses. She saw an older server bow her head and apologize when Margaret said her hairstyle was ruining the party's image. She saw smiles vanish the moment a guest turned their back. They were all very small things, but to Eleanor, those small things were big enough. Because in this world of manufactured perfection, the truest thing wasn't in the white flowers, the silk dress, or the compliments that were about to be exchanged. The truest thing was in how people treated someone they believed to have no power. And Eleanor knew that if she just waited a little longer, this house would tell her all of its truths. The party gradually got into full swing. As the first guests settled in, wine glasses were raised at just the right moments, and laughter rippled gently through small groups. And everything, from the outside, looked as perfect as Margaret Cole had wanted. No incidents, no loud voices, nothing obvious enough to be called a mistake. But the most revealing things are always the smallest ones. Vanessa stood near the backyard, where the natural light softened her features, a place where she could easily become the center of attention without trying. When a group of older guests approached, she tilted her head slightly, offered a smile that was just warm enough, and lowered her voice a tone to ask about their health, recalling a small detail from their last meeting that made them feel remembered. Everything was perfect, until the server standing behind her was a beat too slow pouring the wine. Vanessa didn't turn around completely. She just glanced. It was a very quick look, one that almost no one noticed, but it was sharp enough for the person on the receiving end to understand they had made a mistake. When the guest in front of her turned away, the smile vanished from her lips for a brief second. Her voice, when she spoke to the server, was lower, colder, and shorter. "Be more careful," just 3 words. Not loud, not insulting, but completely devoid of kindness. Then, instantly, as another person approached, Vanessa's face transformed. The smile returned to its place, her eyes softened, as if that moment had never happened. From the other side of the room, Eleanor saw it all. She stood by a small table holding a tray of glasses, not joining any conversation, not trying to draw any attention. She didn't need to hear every word. She only needed to see how Vanessa could switch between two different people in such a short amount of time. One person for those who could be of use to her, another for those who held no value in her world. A little later, Vanessa was aided into a conversation about charitable activities. A middle-aged woman mentioned an educational fund her family had contributed to for years. Vanessa nodded, her expression growing more serious, her voice slowing as if she were speaking of something deeply important. "I've always believed that educational opportunities are the foundation for changing a person's life," she said, her hands resting gently on her wine glass, her gaze direct and held just long enough to create a sense of sincerity. The people around her nodded. A few smiled in approval. But when the conversation shifted to organizing a visit to a school in the suburbs, Vanessa paused for the briefest of moments. Not long enough to be called hesitation, but long enough for a careful observer to notice a lack of enthusiasm. "My schedule is quite full next month," she said, her voice still light, still polite. "But I will certainly try to make arrangements if I can." The perfect line. No refusal, no commitment. Immediately after the conversation ended, she turned and asked Margaret about the timing for that evening's photo shoot, whether the outdoor lighting was good enough, and if the shoulder of her dress needed to be adjusted to look better in the photos. Between the two topics there was no transition, only a shift in priorities. Eleanor noted it. She didn't rush to a conclusion. She didn't assign a label. She simply put each detail in its proper place, like someone assembling a picture from very small pieces. A young waitress walked by, holding a tray of small pastries. One of them was slightly out of place. Vanessa saw it. No one else noticed. She walked over, saying nothing at first, and simply used her fingertip to nudge the pastry back into alignment, before letting out a nearly inaudible sigh. "Details like this," she said very softly, "ruin the whole image." The waitress nodded quickly, stammering an apology. Vanessa didn't look back. She had already turned away. In the background, Eleanor remained standing. She wasn't surprised. What she saw wasn't a single clear act of cruelty, but a series of small, repeated choices consistent enough to form a true portrait. A person doesn't need to shout to show their contempt. They just need to change their tone, shift their gaze, at just the right moment. Daniel was standing near the large glass doors overlooking the sea, talking to an old friend. He was laughing freely, speaking of future plans, of maybe moving part of his work closer to the city after the wedding. When Vanessa approached, he turned to her instantly, his eyes softening, as if nothing else around him mattered more than her presence. Vanessa placed a hand on his arm, her smile returning to its familiar place. In that moment there was no sign of the coldness from just before. To Daniel, she was still the woman he had chosen. To everyone else, she was the image they wanted to believe in. Only a few, if they looked long enough, would notice the slight misalignment between the two. Eleanor didn't interrupt their conversation. She didn't need to. She just continued to move among the guests, carrying wine glasses, setting down trays of pastries, listening to fragmented bits of conversation, and observing how each person reacted when they thought no one important was watching. An older man nodded his thanks upon receiving a glass of wine. A young woman didn't even look at the server as she reached out her hand. A married couple had a small argument, then immediately smiled the moment someone else walked over, and Vanessa, at the center of it all, maintained her perfection. It's just that this perfection, when seen up close, was no longer seamless. It had tiny fractures. The cracks weren't large enough to shatter an image immediately, but they were enough for a keen observer to understand that the image was constructed, not formed naturally. Eleanor didn't need grand proof. She just needed these details, because in her world, People weren't judged by how they behaved when all eyes were on them, but by how they treated someone who had no ability to change their position in the room. And in this house, on this seemingly perfect afternoon, the truth wasn't on the dining table, nor was it in the spoken words. It was in those very brief moments when no one thought they were being seen. Eleanor had seen enough, and she knew that what was coming wouldn't be the result of one big mistake, but of these small things accumulating until they could no longer be hidden. The decision didn't come in a moment of impulse, but formed very slowly, the way a person realizes that if they keep watching things from a safe distance, they will never see the truth. After her first meeting with Vanessa, after the overly polished, sweet words and the small details that didn't add up, Eleanor Whitmore understood that if she appeared as herself, every door would be held open, every word would be carefully chosen, and every person in that room would become the best version of themselves, if only for a few hours. She didn't need another perfect performance. She needed to see what happened when no one thought they needed to perform. The evening before traveling to the Hamptons, Eleanor sat alone in her study, a familiar room with dark wood books, antique paintings, and a soft golden light. On her desk was her phone, an invitation, and a pre-arranged schedule for an official trip she could join at any time with a simple nod. But she didn't touch any of it. She thought about Daniel. Not about his position in the family, not about the assets he would inherit, but about the way he looked at Vanessa, about the almost absolute trust he placed in a woman she still couldn't fully understand. Eleanor wasn't afraid of losing control. She had never needed to control Daniel that way. What she feared was him entering a relationship where he was only in love with a perfectly curated image. And if that were true, she didn't want to be the one standing on the outside, guessing. She wanted to see it from the very root. The next morning, Eleanor woke up earlier than usual. No assistant, no maid entered the room to prepare her outfit as they did every day. She opened her wardrobe, where perfectly tailored dresses and coats, cut to a standard only a few ateliers in New York could achieve, were hanging. She looked at them for a moment, then closed the doors. In the deepest corner of the room was a small, rarely used closet. Inside were simpler clothes, once used for charity trips, when Eleanor didn't want her presence to change how people behaved. A dark dress, without any accents, without a recognizable brand. A plain linen apron, a pair of low-heeled shoes, sturdy enough to stand in for hours. She took them out and placed them on the bed. The diamond ring on her hand was the first to come off, no hesitation. She placed it in a small velvet box and closed it carefully. Next were the earrings, the necklace, the watch Daniel had given her for her birthday many years ago. One by one, they were put away, as if each item carried a piece of the identity she needed to temporarily leave behind. When Eleanor finished changing into the server's uniform, she stood before the mirror. The woman in the mirror was still her, but she was no longer the Eleanor Whitmore that everyone on the Upper East Side would instantly recognize. There was no longer a sign of power, no longer the perfection maintained through every detail. Just a neat, ordinary, middle-aged woman, easily overlooked in a crowded room. That was exactly what she needed. The car that took her to the Hamptons didn't stop at the main gate. The driver had been instructed beforehand to turn onto the small road behind the Cole estate, where delivery vehicles had been coming and going since early morning. There was no red carpet, no one to greet her. Only boxes of food being unloaded, staff hurrying back and forth, and a side door that opened directly into the kitchen area. Eleanor stepped out of the car, holding a small bag, and no one paid her any mind. A temporary staffing manager stood near the door, glanced at a list, looked her up and down, then nodded as if she were just another name among many. "Get inside. We're short-staffed." No one asked where she came from. No one needed to know. She passed through that door and into the narrow hallway behind the main house, a place with no decorative lights, no music, only the clatter of dishes, the rush of footsteps, and brief, clipped instructions. Here, everything operated to serve the perfection out front, but it didn't need to be beautiful itself. Eleanor didn't try to stand out. She took a tray of glasses, quickly learned how to move between rooms without bumping into anyone, how to stand in just the right spot while waiting for an order, how to listen without making others feel watched. Every step had a purpose, but no one noticed. That was the greatest advantage of being considered unimportant. From behind the door leading to the living room, Eleanor could see Vanessa, could hear her voice, could observe how she could change in a matter of seconds depending on who was in front of her. No one's gaze lingered on her for more than a second. No questions were asked. She had vanished from their world, and in that state everything started to come into sharper focus. Eleanor hadn't come to punish. She had come to confirm. If Vanessa was truly the person Daniel trusted, she would see it, even when no one was looking. And if not, she would see that too. In that house, surrounded by trays of champagne and well-rehearsed smiles, Eleanor Whitmore stood at the lowest rung, observing quietly, not interfering, not rushing, because she understood something very simple. The truth never reveals itself when people are being directly tested. It only comes out when they believe they no longer have to hide. And today, in the role of someone no one noticed, Eleanor was giving them that chance. The time between serving rounds was always a little quieter in the back hallway, enough for the staff to catch their breath, but never truly rest. The light here wasn't soft like in the party rooms, and there was no music, only the sound of shoes on the floor and the faint clinking of metal trays. Eleanor was carrying a tray of hot tea to the second floor as requested, her steps even, keeping just enough distance from the narrow wall to avoid spilling anything. She had grown accustomed to this rhythm in just a few hours, enough to avoid drawing attention, enough to exist as part of the stream of forgettable faces. Ahead of her, Vanessa had just left the dressing room, her white silk dress having just given a final adjustment. The train of the gown trailed lightly onto the hallway floor, as if it belonged in a place with no dust, no flaws, no hurried footsteps of others. The distance between them wasn't great. One wrong step, one imperfect turn, and the toe of Eleanor's shoe brushed lightly against the back of the fabric. So lightly that, if you weren't looking, it was almost unnoticeable. But Vanessa noticed. She stopped instantly, not because the touch was strong enough to damage the dress, but because in her world, some things were not allowed to happen, no matter how small. Eleanor stopped too. The tea tray remained perfectly balanced. Not a single drop was spilled. For a brief second, no one said anything. Then Vanessa turned. Her expression changed completely. Gone was the gentle look she wore for her guests. Gone was the mild annoyance one might expect. This time it was clearer, sharper, with no need for concealment. Her eyes traveled from the simple shoes, up the apron, to Eleanor's unadorned face, and a silent conclusion was reached. Insignificant. The slap came right after, quick and decisive. The sound echoed in the narrow hall, bouncing off the nearby walls, startling two servers at the other end. One, holding a towel, froze mid-motion. The other clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles turned white. No one stepped forward. No one said a word. Vanessa didn't scream. She didn't have to. "What do you think you're doing?" she said, her voice low, each word distinct, unhurried, unwavering. "Do you have any idea what this dress is worth?" Eleanor stood still. One hand gently touched her cheek, where the red mark of a handprint was beginning to show clearly under the white light. She didn't fight back, didn't rush to explain. She just looked at Vanessa, long enough to make the silence between them more uncomfortable than any words could be. Vanessa took another step closer. The space between them was now so small she could lower her voice and still be certain she was heard. "People like you," she said, her gaze unwavering, "don't belong in places like this." At the end of the hall, a young server swallowed hard, her eyes darting between the desire to step in and the clear fear of becoming the next target. No one moved. The air grew thick. Eleanor lowered her hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, not high, not carrying the anger one would expect in that situation. "There are people," she said, looking straight at Vanessa, "who are only polite when they need you." The words weren't loud, but they were clear enough for those standing nearby to hear. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, not because the remark was funny, but because in her world someone in Eleanor's position had no right to make such an observation. "Then you should remember your place," she replied, lightly adjusting the shoulder of her dress, as if brushing away an invisible speck of dust, "and learn not to touch things that are beyond your reach." She turned and walked away immediately after that. No more words were needed. The white dress moved down the hallway again, smooth, perfect, as if nothing had just happened, leaving behind nothing but a lingering silence. The young waitress took half a step forward, then stopped, her eyes filled with concern. Are you all right?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling. Eleanor adjusted her gloves and picked up the tea tray once more, her movements as precise as ever. "I'm fine," she answered. No complaint, no sign of weakness. Just a calmness so profound, it left others unsure how to react. She walked on, passing through that same stretch of hallway as if it were just another small part of her job. But behind that serene gaze, everything had been recorded. It wasn't just the slap, it was how it happened, how no one intervened, how those around them chose silence to protect their own positions. And most importantly, how a person reveals their true nature when they believe the one before them has no power. Elsewhere in the house, the laughter continued. None of them knew that right here in this narrow hallway, the most significant event of the afternoon had just occurred, and its consequences were only just beginning. Beyond that hallway, everything carried on as if nothing had happened. The music was still soft, wine glasses were still being filled, and the pleasantries continued right on cue. Only one thing had changed, something small yet irreversible. Eleanor no longer saw this house as a party. She saw it as a system in which every person was playing a clear role, and she needed to know where Vanessa's true role lay. Late in the afternoon, as guests began to move between different areas, Eleanor was asked to bring a fresh pot of tea to a small sitting room behind the staircase, a place reserved for more private conversations. It was the kind of room no one paid much attention to, but it was also where people spoke more truthfully. The door wasn't completely closed. It was left ajar just enough for sound to escape. Eleanor paused for the briefest of moments, not long enough to be noticed if someone walked by, but long enough to recognize the voices inside. Vanessa and Margaret, no other guests, no polite laughter, just their true voices unguarded. Eleanor softened her steps, placing the tea tray on a small table just outside the door, like someone waiting to be called in. She didn't press her ear to the door. She didn't need to. What was being said inside was clear enough. "He signed it very quickly," Margaret said, her voice lower than usual but not at all worried. Too quickly, Vanessa let out a soft laugh, not the kind she used for guests. "Daniel isn't the type to read every line," she said. "He's trusting." especially when he thinks he's doing the right thing. Eleanor didn't move. And what about the trust fund? Margaret asked. His mother has direct control, correct? For now, yes, Vanessa replied. But after the wedding, we can propose a restructuring. Move a portion to joint signing authority. The reasoning is simple. Managing family assets requires more flexibility. Margaret was silent for a second. Eleanor Whitmore isn't one to give up control easily, she said. She doesn't have to, Vanessa answered, her voice still soft, but with something more definite in it. We just need Daniel to sign first. Once a portion of the shares are directly in his name, he has the right to propose changes to the management structure, and he will do it if he thinks it helps our future. Our future, Margaret repeated, as if testing the feel of the words. Vanessa didn't correct her. Outside, Eleanor stood, not changing her posture. Inside, Margaret's voice lowered another notch. And the company shares, she asked. The part in the family investment fund. Vanessa answered almost immediately, as if she had thought about this many times. We can't touch that directly, she said, but we can influence it through the board. Daniel will be given a formal voting position after the wedding. From there, it's a process. Not fast, but it's certain. Margaret let out a soft breath, and Eleanor. This time, no one spoke right away. Eleanor was still standing there. Not a single sound came from her. Vanessa spoke first. She will no longer be an issue, she said. There was no hesitation, no softness, just a conclusion. After everything is settled, Daniel will need his own space. We can suggest she move back to the house in Connecticut, where it's quieter, more suitable for her age. A very logical decision. And you think she'll agree? Margaret asked. Vanessa gave a small laugh. It doesn't matter if she agrees or not, she said. What matters is that Daniel thinks it's the right thing to do. A very brief silence. Then Margaret spoke more slowly. Don't you think you're going too far? Vanessa didn't answer right away. When she did speak, her voice was no longer that of someone trying to convince another person. It was the voice of someone who had decided long ago. There's no such thing as too far when someone else hands you the keys, she said. Marriage isn't a fairy tale. It's a structure. Whoever understands the structure controls the outcome. Eleanor gently closed her eyes for a very brief second, not out of surprise, but because everything was now perfectly clear. Do you love him? Margaret asked. The question hung in the air. Vanessa didn't avoid it. He's kind, she said, and that makes everything easier. The word love wasn't there. It wasn't needed. Outside the door, Eleanor opened her eyes. She didn't step inside, nor did she leave right away. She stood for another second, long enough to be certain that nothing was missing from the picture she had just overheard. Trust fund, company shares, signing authority, a position on the board, and a very clear plan to remove her from the center of it all. There was no surge of anger, no hasty reaction, only a very deep silence. Eleanor picked the tea tray back up and knocked lightly on the door, as if she had just arrived. Vanessa's voice immediately changed. Come in. Eleanor entered the room and placed the teapot on the table. As she lowered her head slightly, Vanessa was back to her familiar smile, her gentle eyes, her soft voice. Thank you, she said. There was no trace of the conversation that had just taken place. No one in that room other than Eleanor knew that just seconds before, every mask had fallen. Eleanor didn't look at Vanessa for too long. She just gave a slight nod, like a servant finishing her task, and turned to leave. The door closed behind her. In the hallway, everything was still the same. But for Eleanor, that afternoon was over. Because from this moment on, it was no longer suspicion, it was truth. And that truth had nothing to do with love. It had to do with power, and how someone was willing to use love as a tool to get it. Daniel Whitmore wasn't the type of man to be easily fooled in the simple sense. He wasn't ignorant, nor did he live detached from reality. He grew up in a family where every number had meaning, where every decision was weighed on multiple levels, where people learned to see through facades from a very young age. But there was one thing he had never learned enough about: how to confront his own emotions when they contradicted his reason. Daniel stood near the back balcony, where the sea breeze blew gently through the low trees, where the sounds from the party inside grew fainter, just enough for a person to think a little more clearly. He held a glass of wine but wasn't drinking, his gaze fixed on the distance, as if looking at something not in the scene before him. A part of him was still in that room where Vanessa had just smiled, touched his hand lightly, and made everything around them feel simpler. Another part was not. He remembered the first time they met. It was a fundraiser in Manhattan, not a massive event, but big enough for the right names to appear. Vanessa was standing near the back of the room, not at the center, but close enough to be seen. She didn't try to draw attention by talking a lot. She just listened, smiled occasionally, and when Daniel approached, she didn't seem impressed. That's what caught his attention. Most people, upon realizing who he was, had a very similar reaction. A slight shift in their eyes, in the way they stood, in their choice of words. Vanessa didn't have that, or at least, that's what he believed at the time. She asked him about his work, but not about his money. She talked about an education project she was interested in, about wanting to do something more meaningful than just appearing at social events. Her voice then wasn't overly confident, as if she were still trying to find the right words, and it was that imperfection that made him believe it was real. Daniel remembered that feeling very clearly. He thought he had met someone who didn't need him to be a Whitmore, just Daniel. Their subsequent meetings only reinforced that belief. Vanessa always remembered the little details. She knew he preferred walks over sitting in a crowded restaurant for too long. She remembered the name of the old manager at his family's ranch. She listened when he talked about the pressure of inheriting something that existed long before he was born. She made him feel understood, and for someone used to being seen as part of a larger system, that feeling was hard to ignore. But then there were the small moments. Very small. Once in a restaurant, a waiter mistakenly placed her water glass on her left side. Vanessa didn't say anything right away. She just paused for a second, her eyes flicking to the glass, then to the waiter. When Daniel looked back, she was already smiling, saying it was fine, that anyone could make a mistake. He had believed that smile. But he also remembered the look that came before it. Another time, at a gathering with friends, Vanessa spoke about a charity trip, about the children she had met, about how she wanted to go back next year. Her voice was warm, her eyes soft. Everything was just right. But after everyone had dispersed, she quietly told him that the trip was exhausting, that the conditions were poor, and that she wasn't sure she'd want to repeat the experience. Daniel had laughed, saying that no one was forcing her to do something that made her uncomfortable. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't want to, because every question could lead to an answer he didn't want to hear. He returned to the present as Vanessa stepped onto the balcony and stood beside him, her hand touching his arm lightly, a habit repeated often enough to feel natural. "Are you okay?" she asked. Her voice was soft, her gaze just as it was when they first met. Daniel looked at her. For a brief moment, two images overlapped in his mind. The woman he believed he loved, and the small details he had seen, had remembered, but had never truly faced. "I'm just a little tired," he said. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Vanessa nodded, not pressing further, as if she knew exactly when to stop. That was part of what made him trust her. She didn't push him. She let him come to his own conclusions. And that very thing made his doubts even harder to hold on to, because there was no external pressure, only a choice from within. Daniel turned back to look at the ocean. He could choose to look directly at the inconsistencies. Or he could continue to believe in the beautiful picture that had been painted for him. Either choice would change everything, and the most dangerous thing wasn't being deceived by someone else. It was convincing yourself that you weren't being deceived at all. Daniel took a slow breath, and then he made his choice. He turned back, smiled at Vanessa, as if there was nothing to question, as if everything he'd seen before were just insignificant details, as if his feelings were strong enough to blur everything else out. And in that moment, neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew someone was acting, and one person was choosing to believe in that performance. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon and the light softened to a deep gold, the party officially began. The music was turned up just a little louder. New groups of guests arrived with slow steps and discreetly assessing eyes, and the entire house seemed to shift into another state. One where everything had to run with more precision, more smoothness, more perfection. From the outside looking in, nothing was wrong. Wine glasses were replaced at the right moment, dishes were served in perfect rhythm, laughter spread evenly among the clusters of people, and Vanessa stood at the center like a fixed point of attention, her white dress reflecting the light, her smile never faltering in the slightest. She moved from one group to another, speaking to the most important people first, listening, nodding, a timely touch of a hand, a timely retreat, as if every move had been rehearsed for years. When Daniel was by her side, she softened. When she stood alone, she was more confident. And when she knew eyes were on her, she became the most perfect version of herself. No one could point to a single obvious flaw, but behind those doors a different rhythm was playing out. In the service area, the air was far more tense than outside. Trays of food were replaced constantly. Brief reminders were called out quickly and decisively, and any minor mistake drew a cold glance, enough for the recipient to understand they wouldn't get a second chance. A young server dropped a spoon. The sound was small, but in that space it seemed louder than it should have. The manager turned instantly, not raising his voice, but saying just one short sentence, enough to make the girl lower her head even further. No one stopped to ask if she was okay. Everything had to keep moving. Eleanor stood in the middle of that current, a tray of glasses in her hand, her steps even. Not too fast, not too slow, no different from anyone else around her. She didn't need to be at the center of it all to see what she needed to see. The most important things always happened at the edge of the spotlight, where people no longer held their images together so tightly. She watched Vanessa from a distance, saw the way she smiled, the way she placed a hand on Daniel's arm, the way people around her reacted as if she had belonged in this world for a very long time. And she saw other things too. A fleeting glance from Vanessa when a server moved a beat too slow, a tiny adjustment of her dress when she thought no one was looking. A brief pause just before she entered a new group of guests, as if selecting the right expression to wear. They were all very small things, but they weren't random. Across the room, Daniel was talking to a family friend. He smiled, nodded, and answered questions about their future plans, about when the engagement would be officially announced, about whether he intended to move part of his work closer to the city. He answered smoothly. He sounded certain, but every so often his eyes would search for Vanessa, as if needing confirmation that everything was still on track. And each time, Vanessa would respond with a perfect smile, not too much, not too little, just enough for him to keep believing. In the back hallway, the young server who had witnessed the slap earlier was still working, but her hands were no longer as steady. Every time she passed Vanessa, she avoided looking up, as if even making eye contact could trigger something unwelcome. Eleanor saw it. She didn't stop. She didn't intervene. She just continued to observe, as she had from the very beginning. Because the most important thing wasn't to react in the moment. It was to let everything run its course. Outside, new cars continued to arrive, their headlights sweeping gently across the trees, reflecting on the glass doors. Inside, the music grew a little louder, as if the party was reaching its peak, a point where everyone believed they were part of a perfect evening. None of them knew that this perfection was only skin deep. The audience had already seen what lay beneath, the words spoken behind a half-closed door, the glances that weren't hidden quickly enough, the small choices repeated often enough to no longer be a coincidence. But Daniel hadn't. He was still standing in the light amidst the music, wrapped in the certainty he had chosen to believe, unaware that just a few steps away, the truth had already been revealed, more clearly than any explanation ever could. Eleanor knew it. She also knew the moment of revelation wasn't far off, because in a room where everyone was trying to maintain an image, all it takes is one true thing appearing at the wrong moment for the entire facade to crumble. And when that happened, no one would be able to go back to where they were. The music was still at its peak when the sound of engines echoed from beyond the gate, not loud, but clear enough for those near the glass doors to turn their heads. A black car stopped, then a second and a third, lining up in a perfect row on the gravel driveway. The headlights reflected off the glass, slicing through the warm atmosphere inside with cold beams of light. A few people in the room recognized the silver logo on the side of the cars. A name that needs no introduction. Whitmore. The atmosphere shifted, subtly, but enough for the discerning to notice. Conversations slowed, eyes began to drift toward the main entrance, and Margaret Cole stood a little straighter, her hand lightly adjusting her sleeve as if preparing for a long-awaited moment. In her mind, the meaning was perfectly clear. This was validation. The Whitmore family hadn't just agreed to come. They arrived with all the ceremony, with their retinue, with a presence that everyone could see. It meant everything was going according to plan, that the gap between their two worlds was finally closing. Vanessa stood beside Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her gaze fixed on the door. But there was more than just curiosity in her eyes. There was preparation. A faint smile touched her lips as if she was ready for her next scene. Daniel, however, was silent. He said nothing, but his expression wasn't quite like the others around him. A flicker of uncertainty, a vague feeling, had just passed through his eyes, then vanished as quickly as it appeared. The doors opened. There was no great stir, no fanfare, just the sound of steady, firm, and orderly footsteps. The men who entered were not guests. They didn't hold champagne flutes, didn't look for a place to stand, didn't scan the room to appraise the space. They moved like men who knew exactly where they needed to go and why they were there. Dark, impeccably tailored suits, focused eyes, not rushed, but not slow either. One of them, older, with silver-streaked hair, paused for a brief second in the middle of the room, as if to get his bearings. Everyone waited. Margaret took half a step forward, her smile at the ready. "We are so honored to." Her sentence was left unfinished. The man had already started walking again. He walked right past her, without a glance, without stopping, as if she wasn't the person he was there to see. Margaret's smile froze. Vanessa didn't move. The footsteps continued. Past the clusters of guests, past the bar, past Daniel. Not a single one of them was acknowledged. Their destination was on the other side of the room, where a server was standing by the tea table, her hand resting gently on a tray, her posture indistinguishable from anyone else around her. Eleanor. The man stopped in front of her. For a split second, no one understood what was happening. Then he bowed, not a slight nod. It was a deep, formal, and deliberate bow, the kind one only offers to a superior. The entire room fell silent. A man behind him followed suit. Then a third. The sequence of actions was quick, but slow enough for everyone to see, clear enough to be unmistakable. Vanessa took a slight step back. Daniel didn't blink. Margaret could no longer hold her straight posture. Eleanor set the tray down on the table. The movement was very slight. She raised her hand, touched the small cap on her head, and calmly removed it, as if it were just a normal part of the evening. Her silver hair, tied back neatly, was revealed under the light. Her expression didn't change. It was only the way the entire room looked at her that changed. No longer a servant, no longer invisible. In a single moment, her place in that room was re-established, clearer than any introduction could ever be. The man standing before her spoke, his voice low and steady. Mrs. Whitmore. No other title was needed. No explanation was necessary. The name was enough. A few people in the room drew a quiet, sharp breath as if they had just realized something they should have seen all along. Daniel stood frozen. His gaze shifted from the man in front of him to Eleanor, as if he were trying to reconcile two different images. The mother he knew, and the woman who had been in this house all afternoon, whom he hadn't even recognized. Vanessa said nothing. Every practiced expression seemed to vanish in an instant too brief to control. The smile was gone, the soft gaze was gone. There was just a blankness. Eleanor didn't look around the room right away. She simply stood up straight, placed the cap down next to a tray, and adjusted her cuffs. Each movement slow, precise, unhurried. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to add any emphasis. Her presence alone was enough to change everything. The room was still bright, the music still played, and glasses of wine were still in guests' hands. But no one was experiencing them in the same way anymore. Because this was no longer a party. It was the moment a truth, one that had existed from the very beginning, finally stepped into the light. And the most terrifying part wasn't that it was revealed. It was the way it was revealed, so calmly that no one could possibly deny it. No scream followed that moment. No one lost control. No emotional accusations were thrown. The room remained still, as if everyone was waiting for something greater than sound, greater than a reaction. Eleanor Whitmore looked around once, very slowly, not to search but to confirm. Everyone was present. Vanessa stood near Daniel, but the space between them no longer felt the same as it had minutes before. Margaret was on the other side, her hand still holding the fold of her dress, but without the same certainty. The guests stood motionless. No one left, no one spoke, as if they understood this was not a moment to interrupt. Eleanor didn't speak right away. She directed her gaze toward the man who had just bowed his head to her. "Begin," she said. "Just one word." The man gave a slight nod, then turned to his team. A file was presented. Not theatrically, not held high, but simply opened at the perfect time, as if it had always belonged to this moment. "Ma'am," he said, his voice just loud enough for the entire room to hear, "the terms regarding the Whitmore Trust have been reviewed, as per your directive." No one understood the full implication immediately, but Daniel understood. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, then to the file, then back to Vanessa.
"Oh, Eleanor spoke."
Her voice as calm as it had been from the start. "The proposed marriage agreement," she said, "is no longer in effect. No emphasis needed. No lengthy explanation." That sentence was enough. Vanessa didn't react immediately. She stood still, as if waiting for the rest of the sentence, as if still believing this was just a step in a negotiation. But there was no rest of the sentence. There was only the next action. The man continued. Access to financial structures related to Daniel Whitmore, he said, including proposals for co-signing and fund restructuring, has been suspended. Margaret took a step forward, no longer maintaining her perfect distance. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice still trying to maintain its civility, but no longer fully in her control. We can sit down and— There is no misunderstanding, Eleanor interrupted, not loudly, but it was final. The room fell silent instantly. These terms, she continued, have been activated based on an internal review and my legal authority. The man turned to another page. The extended lines of credit for Cole Holdings, he said, will be immediately reviewed under the Risk Provisions Clause. There was no need to use the word revoked. No need to say, cut off. Those who understood, understood. Margaret didn't take another step. She stood frozen, as if she had just hit a boundary she previously thought she could cross. Vanessa looked directly at Eleanor. The soft expression was gone. The subtle adjustments were gone. There was only silence. Eleanor took one small step forward. What is built on a false premise, she said, corrects itself when that premise is removed. Not a single word was personal. No mention of the slap. No mention of what she had overheard. But it was all there. The man closed the file. Official notifications will be sent to all relevant parties, he said, including financial institutions and media partners. A few people in the room exchanged glances. No one said it out loud. But they understood what that meant. Not a loud scandal, but a chain of precise information, enough to change how an entire system perceives a name. Daniel was still standing there. He didn't intervene. He didn't object. His eyes were no longer searching for Vanessa. He looked at Eleanor, and this time he didn't look away. Eleanor turned to look back at him for the first time since entering this room as her true self. There was no anger, no visible disappointment. There was only a silence long enough for him to understand that what had just happened wasn't a reaction, but a decision. Vanessa opened her mouth, as if to say something. Then she stopped, because there were no words left that fit the situation. No explanation could put things back the way they were. No apology could change the chain of events that had been set in motion. Eleanor turned away. She didn't need to wait for a reaction. She didn't need to end with a powerful statement, because what needed to be said had already been said. And the most important things didn't need to be said at all. The room remained as it was, fully lit, full of people, full of everything that had been prepared. But the order within it had changed, not because someone had raised their voice, but because one person, without raising her voice, could still make everything shift. And that was a form of power that no words could ever replace. There was no loud explosion after that evening, no chaotic scene, no one chasing after a car, no pleas echoing through the gates. Everything ended with the familiar order of the upper class, where the most important things don't happen in front of a crowd, but unfold slowly, discreetly, and irreversibly. The next morning, phones began to buzz, not with rumors, but with announcements. Emails were sent out, brief, precise, emotionless. Financial partners received updates about a risk reassessment related to Cole Holdings. Banks adjusted their credit limits. The words weren't conclusive, but they were enough to change the way every system operated. Within a few hours, things that had once been considered stable began to shift. No one called it a punishment, but the result was exactly the same. Margaret Cole understood this better than anyone. She sat in her office, her hand resting on the polished wood desk, looking at a screen without needing to read every line to know what was happening. Calls that were once answered instantly were now put on hold. Names that once proactively invited her to events no longer appeared on priority contact lists. No one said they were turning their backs. They just weren't there anymore. The investments she had once been so proud of were now under review. Clauses written months ago were being reopened with a different interpretation. Nothing broke immediately, but everything became more fragile, as if just one more bit of pressure would cause the entire structure to collapse on its own. Margaret didn't scream. She wasn't the type to lose control easily. But for the first time in years, she realized some doors could not be reopened by willpower alone. Upstairs, Vanessa was in the room that just last night had been prepared for a perfect evening. The white dress still hung there, not yet put away, like evidence of a performance that was stopped mid-scene. She stood before the mirror, the same face, the same eyes, but no longer the same position. Her phone lit up a few times, then went dark. The messages from friends, from acquaintances in her social circle, no longer carried the same tone. No one asked directly what had happened, but everyone asked just enough for her to understand that they already knew something. A canceled invitation, a meeting postponed for another day, a reply shorter than usual, small signs repeating themselves. Vanessa read them, then put her phone down. She didn't cry, not because she felt nothing, but because she had never learned how to react to losing something she had always believed was hers to have. Downstairs, the house was the same. The furniture hadn't changed. The flowers were still fresh. The chairs were still arranged in their proper places, but their meaning had changed. The people who once came here to be seen no longer had a reason to appear. The conversations that once filled the living room now took place elsewhere, with different names. No one needed to say that the Cole family had lost their place. They were simply no longer mentioned in the same way. In the days that followed, the process continued. Slowly but surely. A loan wasn't extended. A project was put on hold. A partner needed to reconsider. None of the decisions were personal. It was just a system, adjusting itself after receiving enough new information. Margaret tried to contact those she believed were still on her side. A few calls connected, but the voices on the other end were different now. Polite, but more distant. Concerned, but non-committal. Vanessa tried appearing at a smaller event a few days later. She wore a different dress, choosing a safer, less noticeable color. She entered the room with her familiar posture, holding the same smile she had practiced for years. A few people looked at her. A few nodded. But no one came closer. No one initiated a conversation. It wasn't that they hated her. It was that she was no longer someone they needed to pay attention to. Vanessa stood there for a few minutes, then left earlier than planned. No one stopped her. No one asked why. On the way home, she looked out the car window at her reflection, and, for the first time, wasn't sure what that image was worth anymore. The things that had once defined her, her perfect appearance, the approval of others, her place in important rooms, were all based on one assumption, that she would keep climbing, that she would marry into the Whitmore family, that the door was already almost open. When that assumption disappeared, everything attached to it disappeared as well. No one had to take them away. They simply left on their own. Elsewhere in the city, new conversations were starting, with new names, new plans, and new people considered more noteworthy. The world didn't stop to look back at a story that had ended. It just moved on. And in that forward motion, some people realized too late that the ground they stood on was never truly solid. Eleanor didn't need to follow every detail. She understood how the system worked. She knew that once belief is withdrawn, anything built upon it won't stand for long. You don't have to push. You just have to stop holding it up. And that's what happened. Vanessa didn't lose everything in one day. But with every day that passed, she lost one more thing. An invitation, a connection, an opportunity, until what was left was no longer enough to hold together the person she had built. And in that silence, no one said it out loud. But the lesson was clear. Things built on falsehoods can look perfect for a while, but when no one believes in them anymore, they collapse faster than anything else. In the days after that evening, Daniel didn't leave the city, but he didn't return to his old life as if nothing had happened either. There were no meetups with friends, no scheduled dinner dates, no media appearances. He stayed, but in a very different way. Eleanor didn't say much to him. She didn't lecture, she didn't rehash what had happened, and she didn't demand a long apology. She only changed one thing: the way Daniel participated in the family's life. Before, he had always had a place waiting for him. A seat in the boardroom, a role in major decisions, a level of trust that was given before he had to earn it. Not anymore. "Start over," Eleanor said one morning, as they sat across from each other in her familiar office. "Not because you're not worthy, but because you don't understand enough yet." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't ask where he was supposed to start. He just nodded. On his first day, he didn't walk into the boardroom. He was sent to the operations office on a lower floor, where the kind of work that never appeared in official reports was handled every single day. The small numbers, the repetitive problems, the things that didn't seem important but kept the entire system from collapsing. No one there stood up when he walked in. No one changed the way they spoke. To them, he was just a new guy. And for the first time in years, that was the truth. His first job had nothing to do with strategy. It was just reading. Reading contracts, reading reports, reading the footnotes he had always skipped over because he thought they didn't directly affect the big decisions. He read more slowly than usual, because this time there was no one to summarize it for him, no one to filter the information for him. He had to understand it himself. On the second day, he was taken to a family-owned property in the suburbs, where apartments were rented at modest prices, and where the people who lived there didn't care about the Whitmore name, only about whether things worked or not. A manager walked him through each floor, pointing out the small problems: a leaky pipe, a door that didn't close properly, a heating system that needed inspection. "These things don't show up in the big reports," the man said. "But if they aren't handled, the people here are the first to feel it." Daniel listened, not like he used to, when he listened only to respond. He listened to understand. One afternoon, he was standing in the courtyard of that building, talking to an elderly woman who lived on the ground floor. She had no idea who he was. She only knew he was someone who had come to check on things. "Are you going to fix that door?" she asked, pointing toward the hallway. "It's been stuck since last week." Daniel looked where she was pointing, then turned back. "Yes," he said, "we'll fix it." There was no grand promise, just a simple answer. The next day he came back. The door had been fixed. No one thanked him. No one knew he was the one who had asked for it, but that no longer mattered in the same way. In the weeks that followed, Daniel continued to move between different departments: offices, the estates, small projects, places he'd never set foot in before because they fell outside the scope of what he thought he needed to know. He met people he'd previously only seen from a distance. The people who served at events, the ones who cleaned up after everything was over, the ones who handled the problems no one wanted to see. One day he recognized the young woman who'd been in the hallway that day, Emily. She didn't recognize him at first, and when she did, she just gave a slight nod, with no obvious change in her posture. No fear, no flattery, just distance. Daniel stopped. "That day," he said, his voice quiet, "I saw." Emily looked at him for a second. "Yes," she replied, "nothing more, no blame." But she didn't downplay what happened either. Daniel nodded. He didn't offer a long apology, because he understood that words, right now, didn't hold the same weight they once did. He turned away and went back to his work. The change didn't happen overnight. There was no single moment where he suddenly understood everything. There were only the repeating days, the small tasks, the conversations that were unimportant to the outside world but meant everything to the people living inside it. Daniel began to realize something. That before, he hadn't lacked information. He had just filtered it to fit what he wanted to believe. He saw the signs, but he interpreted them in a more convenient way. He heard the words, but he only held on to the parts that made him feel safe. It wasn't because he was weak. It was because he'd never been forced to face the consequences of not looking. Eleanor wasn't monitoring his every move. She didn't have to. She simply placed him in an environment where he couldn't rely on his position to understand things. He had to experience it. He had to see. He had to listen. You have to realize that the world doesn't operate the way you think it does when you're standing at its center. One morning, a few weeks later, Daniel returned to Eleanor's office. No appointment, no preparation. He stood at the door for a moment, then knocked. "Come in." Eleanor's voice came from inside. He walked in. No documents, no plan. He just stood there. "I understand now," he said. Nothing more, no explanation. Eleanor looked at him. She didn't ask what he understood, because if he had to explain it to prove it, it would mean he didn't truly understand. She just nodded, very slightly. "Keep going," she said. Daniel nodded in return. He turned away. There was no clear end to that process, because maturity isn't a destination. It's a series of choices, repeated long enough to become a way of being. And this time, Daniel was no longer learning through words. He was learning from what he had seen, what he had overlooked, and what he was no longer willing to ignore. Spring arrived later than the year before, but as the trees in the garden behind the Whitmore family townhouse began to turn green again, everything seemed to settle into a different rhythm, quieter, less chaotic, and more real. Daniel no longer appeared in his old familiar places. It wasn't because he wasn't invited, but because he no longer sought them out. His evenings were simpler now, most of his time dedicated to work, to meetings without cameras, without spotlights, and where no one demanded he become a better version of himself. One afternoon he was asked to visit a small school on the outskirts of the city, where the family's charitable foundation was funding a new academic program. There was no grand ceremony, no long speeches, just a visit to check on the progress, meet a few people in charge, and see how things were running. The school wasn't large. The walls were painted in light colors, the hallways were simple, the desks and chairs didn't quite match, but everything was clean. The sound of children's voices echoed from the playground out back, uneven, without a steady rhythm, but full of energy. Daniel walked with a project manager, listening as she explained the program, its challenges, and the small changes that had been made in recent months. He nodded, asked a few questions, not to appear knowledgeable, but to truly understand. As the conversation was winding down, a young woman walked into the room, holding a stack of documents. "Sorry, I'm late," she said, her voice even, not rushed, not trying to draw attention. The manager turned. "This is Olivia," he said. "She's in charge of the curriculum." Daniel looked at her, not with the same assessing gaze as before, just looking. Olivia wasn't wearing anything special. A simple blouse, dark pants. her hair tied back neatly. No flashy jewelry, no detail chosen to impress. She placed the documents on the table, flipped open a few pages, and began to explain the changes in the program, how they were adjusting the content to better suit the students. She spoke clearly, without rambling, not trying to make things sound better than they were. At one point she paused, searching for the right word, then continued. Not perfect, but real. Daniel realized he was listening in a different way, not to look for something remarkable, not to see if she was impressive, but simply to understand what she was saying. The exchange ended simply. There was no memorable moment, not in the old sense, no lingering gaze, no calculated smile. It was just a meeting. As Daniel was about to leave, Olivia turned back for a folder she'd left on the table. She gave him a slight nod as she passed. "Hello," she said. That was it. She didn't ask who he was. Her tone didn't change. She didn't linger a moment longer than necessary. Daniel nodded back. "Hello?" And she was gone. Without a backward glance, he stood there for another second, then walked outside. A light breeze blew across the campus grounds, carrying the chatter of students and the sound of footsteps on pavement, unscripted sounds that made the space feel alive in a way those perfect rooms never could. Daniel looked around. There was nothing to prove here. No one was trying to be someone else. Everything was simple, and because of that, it was clear. He didn't think much about Olivia as he left, not because she wasn't noteworthy, but because for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to assign some great meaning to an encounter. A few days later, while reviewing a report on the program, he saw her name again. No special title, no long introduction, just a name on a list of people doing the work. But this time, he paused for a little longer, not out of curiosity, but because he realized something very simple. That before, he was used to seeing people through their outward appearances, by how they made him feel, by the image they constructed. But now, he was starting to see them for what they did when no one was watching. And that difference, however small, changed everything. That afternoon, Daniel returned to the townhouse. Eleanor was in the garden, walking slowly among the rows of trees, as she often did. He walked over to her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood beside her for a moment. "I met someone today," he said after a few seconds. Eleanor didn't ask for details. She just waited. "Nothing special," he continued. "But I think I was finally seeing things the right way." Eleanor gave a very slight nod. "And that is enough," she said. It didn't matter who that person was. It didn't matter what was going to happen next. Because the most important thing wasn't about who Daniel would meet. It was about how he saw them. In that quiet garden, there was no climax, no grand finale, no firm declaration about the future. There was only a very small yet irreversible shift. Daniel was no longer searching for things that glittered. He was beginning to recognize the value of things that didn't try to be seen. And there are some changes that, once they happen, don't need to be spoken to exist. They are simply there, clearer than anything that came before. Some people spend years trying to convince others they belong somewhere. And then there are those who need only a single moment for everything they've built to quietly fall away, with nothing left to hold on to. If you were Daniel, would you have realized it sooner? And do you think Vanessa deserved what she got? Or was it just the natural consequence of the choices she kept making? Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If you feel like you've ever overlooked the small signs like Daniel did, or have met someone who was only kind when they needed you, please leave a comment. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to follow the channel so you don't miss the next stories, where every situation isn't just drama, but also something that makes us reflect on how we choose, how we trust, and how we treat others. I'll see you in the next video.